Today I want to talk about this very interesting lens by Lumix. This is the 85 1.8. This is an unscripted go at this review. There are things to love and there are things to not love so much. For the value it gives you, for how purpose built it is for video, I honestly I love this lens because it look how tiny it is. It's such a tiny lens. It's actually almost the same size as their kit lens, which is great. This lens is quite light. I'll write the weight somewhere. And this is part of a series of Lumix S-line lenses that seem to be sharing the same body. So they all have a 65 millimeters thread and they all seem to be of the same height, of the same thickness, and almost similarly weighted. Which what it does is that it allows you to have a set of lenses. All of them will look the same, will have the same weight and balance. So you get used to the feel of the lens and the body together. Also, when you're using a gimbal, you don't have to actually set the gimbal, balance the gimbal once again, because these lenses are made to be used with gimbal. So that's very thoughtful of Lumix. So I like the philosophy and the idea behind Lumix. Lumix has decided that a few other things are probably not so important. So we'll talk about that. Wide open at f1.8, this lens has a little bit of vignetting. So vignetting at times is great. If you don't like it, then yeah, this lens has it. Good thing about Lumix is that if you use the S5 II or 2X, you can actually correct for the vignetting in the camera. So of course the camera will know what lens it is and it will correct for the vignetting accordingly. But then whenever you correct for vignetting and things like that, any kind of lens distortion, what happens essentially is that you're losing a bit of information on the file, right? So it's dark on the side and you're trying to brighten it up, which means that you're boosting the shadows in those areas. You're losing a bit of dynamic range there. So it has got that vignetting at 1.8, but 2.8, it doesn't seem to show much vignetting, which is great. I mean, basically 2.8, it starts becoming very usable. So the question therefore is, at 2.8, does this lens become near perfect? Well, unfortunately, it does not. This lens has quite a bit of chromatic aberration or fringing, not in the out of focus areas, which is LCA, or which is longitudinal chromatic aberration. I'm here talking about fringing. So even in the in focus areas, you will see a bit of strong purple, almost blue fringing. It feels like something has been, the object has been etched or outlined with a neon color. I don't like that look. I used to have that look with DSLRs and DSLR lenses a lot. This lens kind of has that strong purple fringing till f4. In fact, if you zoom in, you can still see a little bit of purple fringing in f4. So at 5.6, it's almost not there. So the 85 1.8S Lumix becomes very usable at f4. It is also f4 where you start to get rid of the longitudinal chromatic aberration, because you see a lot of that at wide open at f1.8. You also see a bit of that, enough of that at 2.8. So at f4, it doesn't have fringing, it doesn't have vignetting, it doesn't have longitudinal chromatic aberration. In terms of sharpness, at the center, right at f4, the lens is quite sharp, really sharp. But it gets sharper by the time you reach f4. So again, this looks like a very good f4 lens if you want optical perfection. If you are looking for background separation and low light capacity and you want a lens that's small, lightweight, easy to handle, well, then this is the lens. I think one other way that Lumix has actually compromised on this lens, because they had to keep the lens short. You see, this is a very short lens, very convenient. But in order to do that, I think what Lumix sort of sacrificed is its ability to not focus breathe. So this lens focus breathes. I won't say it focus breathes a lot, but it focus breathes visibly. Now, because it is a video lens, that's why I'm talking about focus breathing, because this line is kind of made for great video. So I would have liked this lens to be maybe a little longer, but without any focus breathing. That would have been a big thing for me. I mean, I can overlook fringing a little bit wide open. I can overlook even vignetting a little bit wide open. I understand that most lenses have that, especially wide open. But focus breathing, it doesn't go away if you stop down. Focus breathing is there, right? So That's something to consider. Now let's talk about the look of the lens. I think this is a very interesting lens in the sense that it's got smooth bokeh in some situations, but then in other situations, especially if the background has irregular patterns, then you will see that the background looks a bit it just doesn't look that smooth. But if the background has pattern that is sort of consistent, then it renders beautifully. I think then the rendition becomes really, really nice. It has a little bit of flair, not too much, just the right amount that can make it look very cinematic, soft, beautiful. I like that. So in most situations, the look of this lens, I think I like this lens. I think I really, really like this lens because it's got that slightly vintage-y look because of how the light, especially highlight areas, look on this lens. And if there is side light happening from the side, I look how it renders. I also like how the foreground bokeh looks on this lens, which is very, very nice. Very few people actually talk about foreground bokeh, but I think foreground bokeh is that one aesthetic thing that makes your photos and videos look 3D, really poppy and 3D. So it has that very nice and smooth foreground bokeh, which I see on my 85 1.2 from Nikon Z. So in terms of look, I really like this lens overall, except for when the background is too irregular or too busy. And when, like, there are details, there are like strings in the scene, or there is hair. Of course, there'll be hair if you're shooting portrait, and this is a portrait lens. I think you'll see a little bit of fringing on the hair, especially if you're focusing on the eye. You might see a little bit of fringing on the eyelids, a little bit of fringing on the hair here, and also longitudinal chromatic aberration in the hair that's not in focus. So, but at f2.8, you're kind of at a stage where you're managing that a bit better. But if you give a little bit of space to this lens when you're composing the image, meaning ensure the background is a little away, far from the subject, and there's a little bit something in the foreground, I think you can create and compose really, really beautiful images with this lens. As a video lens, as a photography lens, it creates a beautiful balance. It's a lens that's purpose built. This lens is not trying to be optically super perfect. What it's trying to be is absolutely beautifully useful for both video and photography. As a portrait lens, the look of this 85 is something that I like. For video, I just wish that it didn't have that focus breathing. So that's about it. So have you considered buying the 85 1.8S from Lumix? If you're using a Lumix camera, I think you should definitely go and get this lens. This is a unique piece. I'm going to see you soon with another one, and subscribe.